Welcome to this joint Reconciliation Initiatives and Heart Edge webinar. This is the second in a joint series of webinars that we're offering in 2021. Let's begin by just taking a moment to center ourselves, to be conscious of God's presence. So find an upright position for yourself in your seat, perhaps with your hands upwards and facing open. And we'll take a two or three deeper breaths. And then in a minute or so, Rosemary will offer a prayer for us to start off this webinar. So let's be still for a minute.
Heavenly Father, in this quiet place, we thank you for this quiet space. We ask that you be present in our thinking, in our speaking, in our hearing, and generally our receiving. We ask for a spirit of courage. We ask for the courage of transparency. We ask for the willingness to move to a space unfamiliar to ourselves. We thank you that you accept us as we are, as imperfect as we are, in the understanding that we are journeying toward being more like Christ. We thank you, Father God, and we ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Rosemary. Well, there are four of us who are going to be offering reflections during the course of the webinar. We'll have all four of us introduce ourselves briefly at this point. So my name is Alistair Mackay. I have two main hats. I'm the director of a small charity called Reconciliation Initiatives, which principally runs a training and development program for church leaders from Anglican churches in Britain and Ireland through an 18-month sort of program. And then I also work in a self-employed capacity, and the main thing I've been doing with that has been working with Carrie Haslam on developing a little program called Being White. And this webinar is a tiny taster of some of that in a sense. So that's me. Carrie, why don't you introduce yourself? You're on mute, I'm afraid.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Carrie Haslam. I call myself a conflict consultant, but my work involves training, mediating, and facilitating. And I have a particular interest in working with race and diversity. And as Alistair said, we've developed a program called Being White, which we have been running in a diocese in London. And the other thing that I wanted to share is that I don't practice a faith. So I'm coming at this from a different perspective, possibly, than some others of you.
Thanks, Carrie. Rosemary, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Rosemary Davidson-Gotobed. I work with the Church of England in the ministry team. My role is my Minority Ethnic Vocations Officer. I've been in the role for now coming up for 5 years. In external overlap of that, I also design and deliver sessions on cross-cultural understanding, racism awareness, and confidence in cross-cultural conversations.
Thank you, Rosemary. And Ruth?
Hi, yes, I'm Ruth Harley, and I am currently an ordinand training at the Queen's Foundation in Birmingham to be a priest in the Church of England. And I'm also the co-author with Al Barrett of Being Interrupted, Reimagining the Church's Mission from the Outside In which we look at questions around mission and the identity of the Church through lenses of gender, class, and race. So that's part of the interest that brings me to this conversation today.
Fantastic, thanks, Ruth. So what the plan is for the webinar is it's going to fall roughly into 3 parts. There's going to be a few opening reflections that I will offer and Kerry will offer. We're then going to give you a chance to have a conversation in a breakout group of about 4 people. We'll then come back, have a chance to hear from Rosemary and from Ruth, and then give you a chance for a second conversation back in those same breakout groups. And then we'll have some time for some sort of concluding reflections together. So that's the pattern of the session. Let me just say a little more about what we're hoping to achieve through this, and I'm going to share the PowerPoint here. So we've got sort of 3 principal objectives during this webinar. One is to share a little of the personal journeys that we're on in facing white privilege in English society. For those of us who are white, we're going to be at different places on that journey. For those of you who might be people of colour, you will have had, I suspect, to have faced this for much longer than we have. But we're going to share a little bit of some of our journeys and give you a chance to share some of that. We're going to try to clarify what do we mean by white privilege, and we're also going to then explore some practical steps for white people in taking more responsibility for addressing our privilege. So those are our sort of kind of objectives for the webinar. I'm going to kick off by sharing a little bit of my own journey, and I want to start by referring to one of the resources that I found really helpful in the last year or so, which is a book by a British author, an English author, Judy Ride, called White Privileged Unmasked: How to Be a Part of the Solution. And in thinking about structural racism and white privilege in British society, this is a resource I've really found useful. A framework that Judy Ride offers in her book is what she calls a white awareness model. And it's kind of an attempt to describe a journey of uncovering one's own whiteness as a white person. And so I'm going to share a little bit of my own journey along some of the different stages of what Ride offers. So here is an overview of Ride's model. The first stage on this journey is what Ride calls denial. She sets out several different types of denial in her book. And looking back for myself, for many years, I think I would probably fit into what Ride calls the colorblind level of denial. In other words, I'd have said something like, well, I'm white, but I get on well with Black and Asian people. Being white doesn't really affect me because I'm not racist. In retrospect, I recognize that I didn't really take the issues around white privilege and structural racial inequality nearly as seriously as I might have done. Certainly looking back in the early 2000s, when I was heading up a training service called Bridge Builders, I offered only one course on cross-cultural conflict in those years, and that one was run by an experienced North American facility. I did notice that most of the people who came on Bridge Builders courses were white, but I thought that really reflected the makeup of British society, and especially of those in church leadership. and I'm ashamed to say I didn't really take active steps to address the issue. A second stage that Judy Ride describes is that of establishing a new openness and a new equality to one another. In 2012, I was approached by another facilitator called Leah Shimada to help deliver a workshop on cross-cultural conflict for a group from the Methodist Church. This nudged me on a journey of exploring issues around different cultural approaches to conflict. And it prompted me to contact a Black facilitator and trainer, Rosemary Davidson-Gottabed, who's with us today, to see if she would be open to working with Leah and myself. I started doing some more reading, and I also had the pleasure of working with two people of a different racial group to my own, with different styles to me and different training approaches. And this really challenged me to be more open, working with Leah and Rosemary as fellow professionals and peers. A third stage that Ride names is that of guilt and shame. But one of the things that she points out is that you don't necessarily go through this cycle strictly in order. And that matches my own experience. Looking back, it's only much more recently that I've engaged with an appropriate sense of guilt and shame about white privilege, and wondered particularly what reparation might look like for me in the roles that I've got. So Ryle's fourth stage is that of what she calls owning up to one's own privilege. That's certainly a journey I've been on in more recent years. And one small milestone for me was a few years ago going on a visit to the Supreme Court in Parliament Square in central London. There we were given a leaflet with a picture of the Supreme Court justices, and I've got it here. Here's the picture. This picture served to remind me that our English society is heavily weighted towards advantaging white people, hence why all the justices are white. It helped me to reflect on how I've taken the privileges of being white for granted and not recognized the ways in which I've got where I am, partly as a result of being white. I've come to recognize that my journey would have been very different if, for example, I had been Black. And that set me on a journey of doing further reading and reflection, including reading Renee Ediolog's book, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, and later Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility, and a range of other books as well. But those two, I think, have been key ones for me. More recently, I've been seeking to move towards Ride's final stage of integration. I've been more conscious of my own white identity and the advantages that this gives me in English society, and I've been working at being more comfortable with my racial identity and seeking to relate in more open, honest and real ways with people of colour. But I'm also recognising that I have still got a long way to go. And the final observation that I'd make is one that Judy Ride highlights. And hence why you can see the sort of circle going back, is that one keeps on cycling back on this journey, which means discovering new levels of denial within oneself and thus needing to keep journeying through the cycle that she offers. Well, that gives hopefully a little taste of the journey that I'm on. Let's now turn to hear from Kerry Haslam. Kerry, offer some highlights from your journey of becoming more aware of white privilege and racial inequality in this society.
Thanks, Alistair. As I said in my introduction, I'm a trainer and a facilitator, and so I have for very many years been involved in delivering training around equality and diversity. And what I've come to realize is I always thought equality and diversity was about looking at other people. So I kind of have a picture of myself in a kind of house looking over the fence at other people who are different from me. And I always thought that I was one of the good white people because I believed very strongly in equality and fairness. That's very strong principles for me. And I didn't go around abusing people who were different or doing any of those what Peggy McIntosh would call the individual acts of meanness. So my understanding of racism, it was about they're either good people like me or there are bad people who are doing horrible and horrific things. It came as a real shock to me to find that I was part of the problem and not part of the solution. And so over the last sort of 4 to 5 years, this has become a very central focus of my work. Other pointers along the way for me were partly, as Alistair has mentioned, looking at why there are so few people of colour in positions of power in this country, despite the fact we've had equalities legislation for very many years. It's fine for people of colour to be good at sport or to be good at oh, I've lost my train of thought there, but to be good, there's some things it's okay for them to be good at, but not running the businesses in the positions of power. So I've come to understand really the institutional nature of racism, the systemicness of it, of this society we're born into, and how it's embedded all the way through our culture. I recognize that this is a society that I've been born into, so it's not one that I've created, but it is one now about which I have a choice about what I do from here onwards. And one of the real changes for me over the last 3 to 4 years is I think that I can see and hear more clearly. So I think I've been very able to move through life quite easily without really recognizing the currency of what people of colour have been saying to me or what I've been reading and hearing. And for me, the journey has been as much a kind of inner journey to get to the place where I can hear and see, as it has been about an outer journey of making changes in my life. Some of the things that I have also noticed is, yes, I don't need to think about my race on a daily basis. So I'm able to move, as I say, very freely through my life. And I come to understand that that isn't the same for many people of colour. I've also struggled to find places to have really honest conversations about race. So 3 years ago, I went to the United States to do a course called Tackling Racism that had been recommended by a colleague. And to a person, I think everybody I told I was going to the States to do a course on tackling racism, everybody said to me, where is the course going to be? Nobody said to me, wow, that's interesting, you're going to do a course on tackling racism. And I think that's very symptomatic of the fears that there are around talking about race. Another kind of key understanding for me has been about how if I'm not actively doing something to challenge this, then I am colluding with the status quo. And that is a status quo where there is more advantage if you're white in this country than if you're a person of colour. So I have been wanting to shift to do something differently, of which the Being White programme that Alistair has mentioned has been a very key part of that. I think I'll finish there, Alistair, and pass back to you.
Great, thank you so much, Kerry. Okay, so we've shared a little bit, Kerry and I, so we're not holding ourselves up as great examples, but it's really to highlight that we are on a journey with this. And so we want to give you a chance now to share in your in some breakout groups. So let me just, I'll bring the slide up with the tasks so that you can see what you're going to be talking about. Here we are. So what has been your journey of recognizing your white privilege or not? So if you're a white person, you're going to be sharing something of your own journey, coming to recognize your own privilege in a society with significant racial inequalities. And everybody in the groups, you're going to be speaking for yourself, please. That would be one of our guide rules. So use I, don't talk about we. If you're a person of color, you'll be sharing something of what you've noticed in terms of how white people are privileged in our society, or if you'd prefer, you can also choose to pass. But there's one other sort of key ground rule we'd set for you in the breakout conversations today. If you're white and you're in a group with a person of color, please don't make that person of colour the focus of your conversation. So that would be our sort of request for you to observe that as a guideline. Ben, I'm hoping that you are pretty much ready to send folks into breakout groups. So you're going to have 12 minutes for this conversation. You'll be normally in groups of 4, so you'll have about 3 minutes each. Use the full time, so let the system bring you back right at the end. But if you're, for some reason, really unhappy, then you're welcome to come back into the main meeting room and to leave your breakout. Okay. Okay. Hopefully everybody is now back with us. Is that right, Ben?
That's right.
Great. Welcome back. I hope it's been useful to reflect on something of your own journey in conversation with a few other participants this afternoon. We want to now try and get a better handle on what white privilege might look like, especially in English and in British society. So let me try and offer you one definition. So here's one possible definition. Why is it not? Can't get the slide to move. Sorry, I've got a technical. Okay, what I'm just going to do is try. I'm just going to try resharing because the PowerPoint seems to be stuck. Okay. Okay, so here's one possible definition for you of white privilege. Inherent advantages possessed by a white person on the basis of their race in a society characterized by racial inequality or injustice. So this is not saying that, for example, if you're a person of color, that you can't have certain advantages. You could have certain educational advantages, have gone to a very good school, for example, but you wouldn't have advantages based on your racial group that you're part of in this society. Whereas for those of us who are white, these are advantages that we enjoy simply because of our racial group. How does white privilege work? Well, here is one way of thinking about it. An invisible package of unearned assets that I can count on cashing in each day, but about which I was meant to remain oblivious. White privilege is like an invisible weightless knapsack of special provisions, maps, passports, code books, visas, clothes, tools, and blank checks. Well, that might seem a kind of a little bit abstract. Let's see if we can try and put a little bit of flesh on this. Rosemary, I'm wondering what white privilege looks like from your perspective as a Black person in English society.
Thank you, Alistair. I suppose it's a rather odd question to ask because to answer rather, because my everyday lived experience is one of navigating everyday racism, micro and macro aggressions, and assumptions. So it's difficult to pinpoint one particular thing. And while thinking about, oh my goodness, what do I say? But I could give 2 examples. In an organization a church organization that I worked for a few years, because of the setup of the then offices, myself and a colleague who was also starting up a new role, we were going to be set up at office at home. So it meant that we would need all the necessary things you would need for an office: a chair, a desk, then back in those days, a fax machine, and you know, all of those things. She and I knew each other because we were pregnant at the same time and our children were around the same age. So we had a lot of things in common. And when we were setting up our offices, she would ask me about certain items that I could recommend, because my father-in-law then was an electrical engineer and knew everything that there was to know about what was the important stuff to have and what was new coming over the hill. So I shared that information with her. And then when it came to actually for me purchasing my bits and bobs, I was told that I had to find the different items, get the quotes, submit them to the office. They would approve them, and then give me the money to other various items that I could then order and have installed. So I don't know. So I just said, okay, then that's fine. Then on a coffee conversation with my colleague, and she was like, oh, everything's arrived at once, and she's setting it up, and if I could get my father-in-law to call her, and she's still got to purchase this and she's still got to purchase that. And I was like, oh, how come? And she would say, well, I was given the check and I've had to, and she goes, well, weren't you? And I said, no, darling, I had to send in, and told her the process, at which point she fell silent. Fast forward to a in-person staff meeting. I was fuming and trying to think of what words to say that made the point, but didn't make me come across as an angry Black woman. And so I was there trying to choose my words carefully, and I decided not to ask a question, which was, could you explain to me why we had two different processes? And in a room with my line manager and a couple of other colleagues, including the colleague stroke friend, I was told by the head of finance that I did not understand their fiscal responsibility, and that was the reason why the money was given to her, but not to me to furnish out my office. And that for me is when the clock started ticking for me staying with that organization. So that was something that always stuck with me. And what stuck with me was the white people in the room who, especially like my immediate line manager, nobody said a word. Everyone just sat there. And these are people I'm supposed to be continued to work with, and in order to get my job done and to establish the offices there. So that's just one example. But, like I say, it's just part of the everyday micro, macro racism that I have to navigate 24/7, 365.
Thank you, Rosemary. Really appreciate you being willing to share that and to give a concrete illustrations. Really helpful. Ruth, I'm wondering whether you can share something of your understanding of white privilege as a white person in English society.
Yeah, sure. I think I want to start by talking about the pervasiveness of white privilege. I think for me as a white person, it has sometimes been too easy to think of it as incidents, and it's not isolated incidents. What Rosemary has just shared with us is one incident, but as she's said, one incident among a whole lifetime of experiencing racism. And I think one of the things that it has helped me to frame this is that when I notice an incident of racism, that's not an incident of racism, that's an incident of my awareness. It's happening all the time, and occasionally, hopefully increasingly often, I notice. And that's because I have a choice. So I often get asked to talk about why and how I've chosen to engage in anti-racist work and anti-racist theology, and critical white theology. And I think the question I'm more interested in is why I've got the choice. And the reason I've got the choice is because I'm white and I benefit from white privilege. My black friends, my friends of colour, don't have a choice about whether they engage with this issue. They don't have a choice because it affects their life all the time. I was really struck by what I said earlier about having previously felt like being white didn't affect his life. But actually, being white affects my life every bit as much and every bit as continuously as being black affects Rosemary's life. It's just that I have the luxury of remaining oblivious to the ways that my white privilege affects my life. One of the things that my co-author Al Barrett and I write about in Being Interrupted is this idea of obliviousness. I don't experience white privilege primarily as someone offering me a privilege. I experience it as not having to think about the things that my black friends have to think about, not having to do the work that they have to do to survive. I experience it as being the default. You know, that picture that Alistair showed us of the Supreme Court, but it's everywhere, whiteness as default. And that's one of the main ways that I experience white privilege in my life. And also that idea that obliviousness to white privilege is not an accident. That's part of how a racist system maintains itself, is by maintaining that obliviousness. And I think the last thing I want to say, with an eye on the time, is to just have a brief word here about intersectionality and white privilege. So the quote that Alistair showed us earlier, the definitions of white privilege that we looked at there, I think one of the bits of pushback that people often engage with quite early on in their journey through this stuff is sort of, well, I'm white, but I don't feel privileged. So, you know, I'm white, but I'm a woman, so I experience misogyny, or I'm white, but I'm working class, so I experience classism, or I'm white, but I'm disabled, so I experience ableism. And all of those things can be true, and none of those things diminish the amount of white privilege we have. They mean we don't maybe have access to other kinds of privilege, but they don't mean that we don't have access to white privilege, because we do. And I think that's a really important thing to get your head around, that privilege never feels like privilege. Privilege feels like not having to think about it. In the same way that we've seen just in this last week that men don't have to think about how they inhabit public space in the same way that women do, because of the privilege that they have, we as white people don't have to think about the way that we inhabit public space in the same way that our friends who are black or people of colour have to think about how they inhabit public space because of the privilege that we have. So I think that's the thought I want to leave you with, is how do you experience privilege as obliviousness?
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ruth. That's really, I think that's really helpful in terms of trying to get a handle on what we mean by white privilege and what it looks like. The challenge is that we're so often blind to what this might mean and what it might look like, because for those of us who are white, it's just part of normal life. And so trying to get to grips with it is not a straightforward process. Let's now turn to think about what it might look like for those of us who are white to take greater responsibility for addressing white privilege and to be contributing to a more just society. My sense is we've often looked to people of colour to do the work for us, and I think the challenge for us now is to step up and be prepared to take some more responsibility. So what might some practical steps look like? What could I do about my own privilege? Well, let me offer one thought as a white person, looking at how I might put my privilege to good use. So I'm asking myself the question, what can I do to enable the voices of people of colour to be better heard? In my role as director of a small charity, Reconciliation Initiatives, This means I'm looking to ensure that we have speakers on our training and development programs who are people of colour. I've got the power to invite people, so I'm looking to be intentional about how I use my power and to provide a platform for the voices of people of colour to be heard. Let's hear some other thoughts and ideas. Carey, would you be willing to pick up the baton at this point? Share a thought or two with us.
I wrote a long list, and then I was sort of thinking which one feels most current for me. I guess what feels most current for me is to do something and to speak up. So I would say I've been a kind of silent observer, and I'm thinking about what Rosemary shared and what Ruth shared. What I'm practicing now is speaking up, taking a risk, taking the risk of getting it wrong, but with the intention of learning and taking responsibility for things changing. So that would be a key one for me.
Fantastic, yeah. And so being prepared to take those risks, that's I think that is a significant action that we can do as white people. Rosemary, I'm wondering, are there one or two ways that you'd like to see white people stepping up and taking greater responsibility?
Yes, thank you. I think taking responsibility for educating yourself, everything that you need to know about how racism functions in our country and in our churches and wider society is in the public domain already. You can, if you really want to do stuff, you can go find it yourself. And that's something that I think is really important. The other thing is to ask yourself, how do I, as an educated person in the 21st century, get to function and be assumed to be as such and still not know what to do about racism in this country? How did I get to this point and not know what to do about racism in this country and still be viewed as competent and still be viewed as able and an engaged member of our church and society? So those would be two things I would encourage folk to do. Answer that question and to go do your own homework.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Rosemary. Okay, well, it's time for us to give you a chance to have a further conversation back in your breakout groups. Let me see if I can get my PowerPoint to behave and bring up the task for you. Yep. Okay, wait. So here's the task for you back in your breakout groups. What's one step I can take as a white person to address my white privilege? Or if you're a person of colour, what's one step you would say to white people that you can take to address your white privilege? So focus particularly in thinking about a step that you can take in the context where you are, in your setting, in the role or roles that you fulfill. If you're a person of colour, feel free to make a suggestion for others, but also feel free to pass. So we're going to give you another 12 minutes back in your breakout groups, and you should be hopefully back with the same people, unless there's somebody who's dropped off the call. So Ben, are you ready to send us back? Fantastic. So I will stop sharing at this point, and folks should be going back to their groups. Okay, well, I think everybody should hopefully now be back with us. I think all the breakout rooms have closed. Welcome back. I hope you've generated some useful ideas. Can I encourage you to contribute some of your ideas into the chat? So this is ideas for one step that, particularly if you're a white person, you can take to address white privilege. So I encourage you to make some contributions into the chat, but we will move to hear a further reflection from Ruth. What's a further thought you've got at this point, Ruth, on what it means to address white privilege and to contribute to greater racial equality in our society?
Thanks, Alistair. Yeah, absolutely. So I think I want to say something at this point about betraying the system. This is a concept that we work with a lot in our book, Being Interrupted. There's a whole host of ways that we as white people can and should be disrupting the racism that we notice around us. There's also a whole lot of ways that we will still continue being oblivious to, no matter how hard we try and keep acknowledging that we are in that circle, that cycle that Alistair mentioned earlier. But I think for me, as well as looking at some of those ways, those sort of tips and techniques about making sure that there's a diverse mix of people at the table contributing to the conversation and all those sorts of things, amplifying the voice of global majority heritage people and all those kind of things, those are really important. But for me, it all comes back to this thing of choice again, and the privilege of having a choice to engage. And I want to say that there is no neutral action, and inaction is also an action. There's no neutrality in this. Like, we live in a racist society and a racist system and a racist church, those of us who are in the Church of England. Certainly, I wouldn't want to speak for other denominations. And we have a choice to collude with the system or to betray the system, which is what we talk about a lot in Being Interrupted. And that has to be an active choice. It has to be a repeated choice and a consistent choice, insofar as any of us can manage to be consistent. And that choice is in itself a privilege. It can feel like a hard thing to do, especially when you first start doing it. So working against the system that you are supposed to remain oblivious as a white person to is hard work, but nothing like as hard work as the work that our global majority heritage sisters and brothers have to engage in, whether they want to or not, all the time in order to survive. So it's hard work that we need to be engaging in. And I think sometimes we have a tendency, I know I feel in myself sometimes, a tendency to shy away from the stuff that feels really uncomfortable and the stuff that hurts me or other white people. And that's because betraying the system, somebody ends up feeling betrayed. That's part of it. And I think acknowledging that reality is really important. But when we fail to betray the system, so that racist system, somebody still ends up being betrayed, and it's the same people who have been betrayed all along. So I think there's a really active choice to make about colluding with the system or betraying the system, and recognizing that there's not a neutral observer point. We don't come at this as outsiders to a system. And I'm going to stop there and let us pick up some stuff from the chat, I think.
Okay, thank you very much, Ruth. And I think that's really significant, is either we have to be proactively making a positive contribution, because otherwise we're just shoring up the status quo. And the status quo is not one really that we want to be affirming at this point. So Carrie or Rosemary, is there something you've noticed in the chat, maybe something we might invite somebody to contribute as a reflection, or something you wanted to offer a comment on?
I'm happy just to pick up a couple of themes, sort of generalizing from some of the comments people have made in the chat. One of which echoes for me, which is about it's our responsibility. So for us as white people to take responsibility and not expect people of color to do the work for us. And there's a lot of themes in the chat box about creating space for people of coloured voices to be heard, either kind of practically in terms of having people in the room, or about not speaking to create space for other people to speak, or about not speaking on behalf of people of colour. So they're kind of really practical, but I also think for me they illustrate the subtlety of what we need to be thinking about. I don't often believe people intentionally want to hurt other people, but it comes because of the way we've learned about our society. So those would be some of the themes for me.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Kerry. Paul Hinton, I wonder if you're willing to take yourself off mute and just contribute, expand a little bit on the comment you've just put in the chat. I think it builds on something that Rosemary said, but I think it'd be good to hear your take on it, Paul.
Yeah, thank you. I don't think I have much to offer here other than I'm learning to teach myself, because I don't want to in any way pressure my black friends again and again to tell me their stories or to justify why I should not educate myself. And I'm very conscious of the fact that, just as Rosemary said, it's all out there. I have learnt to take journeys into books and videos that I never sought before, and I found it very helpful, the concept of obliviousness, to just begin to own up to my own ridiculous obliviousness.
Thank you so much, Paul. I can absolutely echo what you're sharing there. That's really helpful to hear that from you. Rosemary, was there something you've noticed in the chat that you would want to sort of pick out, either invite someone to contribute or you wanted to offer a comment on?
I wanted to offer a comment on two things, if I may. First, the use of acronyms and so forth. It's really important when we engage in a lot of this work involves conversations, and I would encourage folk to be very clear about what they mean and to say what they mean when they use acronyms like BAME. I don't use it, I don't like it. And if I have to use it for the sake of the audience, I say Black, Asian, and minority ethnic. If I write it, I put the BAME in inverted commas. And be very specific about that. It's not the only term. There's UK minority ethnic or UKME or people of global majority heritage. Just think about where you are and who you're speaking to, and how what would be the most helpful. The second thing is it's more offered as a way of encouragement. This is hard work. Do not look to be congratulated for doing work you should have nailed before you left secondary school. And everything in our society and structures is geared towards turning you back. The minute you become aware, you immediately start swimming against the tide. And the pushback is relentless, and it is exhausting, and it is thankless. And people who've known you for years will suddenly want to know what's wrong with you as someone who's, what's your problem? You know, why have you changed? And, you know, I would encourage you to say, why haven't you? Why am I, what's wrong with you? Be very, and also seek friends and people that you probably would never have collaborated before. Start putting together some of that infrastructure of support, because everything, and I do mean everything, in our church and society is geared towards you not being different, being better, doing better. And it's a lifelong thing. I can tell you, it's a lifelong thing. But you will survive it as long as you keep moving. And yeah, I just want to offer that to folk.
I mean, that resonates really strongly for me, Rosemary. So interestingly, in the past, I've done a lot of work on sort of handling conflict better, and I've had lots of sort of positive feedback on it. It's been really striking with the work that Carrie and I have been doing with Being White. We've not been getting those positive strokes, and it's much harder work and much costlier work. But it's, you know, as you're challenging us, it's absolutely the right thing to be doing. What, in many ways, why weren't we doing this before? But, you know, at one level, I'm saying better late than never. Anything else that either Carrie or Ruth have noticed in the chat that you would want to either invite somebody to contribute, or that you'd like to comment on?
Sure. Can I just pick up? There's quite a lot of stuff about which voices and whose voices are being heard in the chat, and that's really good. That's really good to see. There's a fantastic comment in there. Oh no, I've lost it. This always happens to me with chat. There we go. From Paul Keeble, talking about creating space, and he asks the question: giving a seat at the table or scrapping the table and starting again? And I think I want to just pick up on that and say a bit about whose table it is. And I think this is the whole making sure you've got a diverse voices in the room thing is really, really important, but is also one of the places where we as white people can fall into a kind of benevolent, not that there is any such thing, kind of benevolent paternalism thing of, oh, well, we must make sure we invite some black people to that panel. Like, that's better than just having an all-white panel, but it's not getting at the root of the problem. And also, I think I want to say something about having strategies up your sleeve for what to do when your attempts to diversify the voices in the room meet with resistance. So this is something I have encountered a lot of times when I've been in a room that is all white people who are making a decision, and I've said, yeah, I notice we're all white people here. What are we going to do about that? And the first problem with that is that it's still, what are we going to do about that? The power is still being located with the white people in that room. But the second problem about that is that very often I have found that I have received quite a dismissive sort of, oh, well, we asked someone but they couldn't come, or, oh, we didn't really know who to ask, or, and it's just not good enough. That is just not good enough as a response, ever. But I've found that because you do get that pushback, I need to have some strategies up my sleeve for what's the next play in this conversation, and what's the next question I'm going to ask, and what's the next way that I'm going to push back. So I think being prepared to meet with that resistance, I think particularly for those of us who are read as, whether we are or not, middle-class white women, we are not used to encountering resistance. And we need to get used to it. But in order to get used to it, we need to have some strategies for how we're going to deal with it.
So what you're sharing there, Ruth, really resonates with the local parish where I'm licensed as an associate priest, and we had some vacancies on the PCC last year, and the vicar asked me, you know, to suggest possible people who could be encouraged to be approached to be part of the PCC, and I suggested a couple of the black women in the church, and he then went and approached them to see if they'd be willing to join, and neither of them was willing to join. And so the question then is, okay, so what am I going to do about ensuring that their voices are heard, given that they don't want to be part of the PCC? And there may be some very good reasons why they don't want to be part of the PCC. But you know, just say, oh well, we tried, and well, they said no. You know, so giving up, that's not good enough at this point, is it? Anything else that any of the three of you have noticed? I'm struggling to keep track on the chat. So is there anything that any of you have noticed, and maybe we could invite somebody else to sort of chip in an observation?
I saw this as a comment here by Margaret, Margaret, I don't know if you want to expand upon what you said, but it's something that I've come across a lot, where dioceses or churches just focus on the same 2 or 3 Black people to do everything. And in my role, in terms of getting dioceses to find ME Vocations champions, I'm having to constantly say they do not have to be Black or Asian. They just have to be passionate about seeing a more ethnically diverse clergy body. And they don't have to do it on their own. It doesn't have to be one person. It could be 2 people or a team of people. And it's important, because this is how you get people to use their white privilege, because there are places and spaces that I am aware that if I speak, people in that room will roll their eyes and go, oh, here we go again. All the tropes, blah, blah, blah. But if Carrie spoke, they would listen, at least give her the first minute or so and listen. And so I know that in my training, I never go in on my own. And if I'm going to be doing stuff around racism, I'm never the person to do the session on racism. It's always the white person, preferably white male person, and the energy in the room is extraordinary when that happens, because you caught people off guard and they're like, so what's he going to talk about? What's she going to talk about that we haven't heard already? And it gives an opportunity for conversation. But, think about ways that you can use your white privilege and if you're passionate about it, put your money where your mouth is, step into that role, use your education, use what you're collating, and get support from maybe the 2 or 3 Black people who've been there, done that. You can do it, but they can give you some pointers and background information. So don't be discouraged.
Margaret, did you want to kind of offer anything additional there, just to pick up your contribution?
Well, I think what Rosemary said addressed a lot of it, but I think there is a certain frustration that, I'm a diocesan officer, I put together events, but I am dealing with being just one individual in a large structure and system and institution that is not terribly welcoming from the minute you walk into the front door of St. Swithin's in the Swamp. If you don't fit the sort of white, middle class, well-educated, at least nominally, usually straight and cisgender idea of what we're supposed to be and how we're supposed to be. And so by the time we're looking at people to take senior roles and be experts to speak into topics, that pipeline has already alienated so many good people who don't fit that idea of what we're supposed to be. And so, yes, as one person within the system, there are things that I can do. And Rosemary, you've given me quite a lot of brilliant ideas. And I did used to work with a close colleague who was a Black man, and we had a deal where if there were no Black people in the room, I'd be the one to ask why, and if there were no women in the room, he'd be the one to ask why. So we kind of supported each other that way. But again, what we're trying to do as individuals is taking place within an enormous system, and that it sometimes feels overwhelming. But thank you for some new ideas and encouragement about things that we can do about that.
You're welcome. Fantastic. And also remember that, especially when you want a guest speaker, you can actually import somebody from another diocese.
Oh, absolutely. But I'm thinking,
I have a list of people. I'm more than happy to send them your way. And, it's great to kind of mix it up a bit.
Oh, and I often do, but things like boards and committees and so on that often recruit from within the diocese, that is often the response I get when I ask that question. So,
I hear that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Great. Thank you, Margaret. Thank you, Rosemary. And thank you to each one of you for showing up for today's webinar. I hope you found it as stimulating as I have, and that you've got something useful out of today. And I'll have some more hope and courage for continuing to engage with this and to contribute to making this a more just society. Let me just let you know what's coming up with our next webinar. So I'm just going to share the details here. Oh dear, sorry. There we go. So next up is Bishops in Dialogue, Anglicans post-Brexit and in the midst of the pandemic. We've got Bishop Goody Francis Decani, Bishop June Osborne, Bishop Andrew Swift and Bishop Pat Story from across the 4 Anglican provinces of England, Wales, Scotland and Ireland. They're going to be in conversation with Sam Wells, the Vicar of St Martin in the Fields. And that is on Tuesday, the 27th of April at 2 p.m. I do hope you're going to be able to join us then as well. So let us draw to a close. Ruth, would you be willing just to offer a final closing prayer for us before we say goodbye to everybody?
Absolutely. Let's take a moment to still ourselves, to become aware of the presence of God with us and in our neighbours. God of all justice and mercy, we thank you for this time and this space to meet together, to speak and to listen with one another, to hear what your Spirit is saying to your church as we seek greater racial justice. As we go from this place, help us to take with us the things that have stirred us to action. Give us courage when we need it, and the right words to speak at the right time and into the right situations, so that we may contribute to increasing the justice of your kingdom. In the power of the Holy Spirit and in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Well, a special thank you to Kerry, to Rosemary and to Ruth for joining me. It's been a joy to work with the 3 of you, and thank you to everybody who's been part of this webinar. Thank you so much for showing up today. God's blessing on you for the rest of your stay and for the days ahead. Goodbye.